So this is Sharon Raji Maynard, and I'm really pleased to have with me today one of our indivisible gazelles, Brad Marsden. And Brad's work has been in helping the First Nation citizens in the Canadian area and helping them to get back in touch with their true identity. And doing that by helping them understand the impact of their traumatic genetic history by understanding and unraveling that. So it's extremely valuable work for the First Nations, and I think a model and important for communities in general, because we all carry that type of genetic trauma history in our own way. So welcome, Brad. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you, Sharon. It's great to be a part of this.
Yes. So tell me, and the listeners, just what got you into this work. Let's start there.
Well, what got me into this work was when, because I grew up on the Indian reservation, and I had no idea what my people have been through in terms of colonization, in terms of historical trauma, in terms of law and policy that kept us isolated from the community, from the rest of society. And I was, as a young boy and understanding a little bit about the residential school, I started to hear about the residential school when I was about 23 years old. And yet I was raised in a home where everybody, in one way or another, was affected by the residential school. And down in the United States, it's called the Indian boarding school. So when I talk about residential schools, I'm talking about the Indian boarding schools. And so I started to hear about what went on in those residential schools, and I started to sort of make connections between why things were the way they were in my communities. I started to connect the dots. When I talk about the lack of affection that a child needs, the nurturement that a child needs. When I'm a little boy, I don't understand. All I know is I'm feeling that something's missing, right? And so out of that conception, that perception of being a little boy and trying to formulate my own sense of self in this world, and it's heavily influenced by something that I wasn't even aware of. So I thought about it, and I'm just like, can you imagine if I had heard about the residential school when I was a little boy? Somebody nurtured me and guided me and helped me make connections in my life and said that, it's not about you, Brad. It's not that you're unlovable, unwanted, unworthy. It's just that the people your environment, your community has been suffering for the last 200 years. There's a lot of unresolved trauma in this community, and nobody's speaking about it because nobody ever spoke about the residential school. And it just seems kind of shocking that like all of this trauma going around and nobody ever talked about it, but it was expressing itself, right? It was expressing itself through alcohol. It was expressing itself through bullying, through shaming, all of those behaviors that are common with, with trauma. So that's how I sort of got into it.
I'm older than you. And yet I know when I was growing up and we, in my community, we did not experience that type of trauma. We certainly were aware of the boarding schools in the area I grew up in, but we didn't experience that type of trauma. But I know that any trauma we experienced was, you just get over it. You just don't talk about it. It's as if it goes away. We didn't have an awareness even in that present moment because talk about what they did with First Nations children. I mean, most of our listeners probably will know, but what was that experience?
Well, the experience was they every September they would take young children, and it was mandatory between the ages of, in 1920 they made it mandatory by law that everybody between the ages of 5 and 16 had to go to those residential schools, right? So there was they called him an Indian agent. He would go around along with the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and they would go around and gather up all of the children, and they would take them, they put them in the back of a truck, or they'd ship them off to the residential schools, however they, whatever transportation they had available to them. And our children, the policy was, I think you've heard this, was to kill the Indian to save the man. And what that means is we were thought of as less than, right? Less than human beings, savages. We've all heard that, those Indians are savages, blah, blah, blah. And what that meant was, okay, well, this vessel that I call a human being, we need to kill the Indian, his identity, right? And in order to make something productive out of this vessel called a man, right? So that was the policy: kill the Indian, save the man. And what happened was, as soon as our children would go there, they had no other experience, no other language that they really knew. It was just like how they were raised, speaking their native tongue. And when they get there, they weren't allowed to speak their language. They were harshly abused. They would, like if they were severely punished if they didn't cooperate and learn the English language, which nobody told them that they weren't allowed to speak it. They didn't know how to communicate any other way. So I can't imagine how a 5-year-old would process all of that information. Just like, I only speak English, but all of a sudden somebody just comes down, grabs Brad out of this house, takes him to a different country, and wants me to learn how to speak their language. I don't know how to communicate with that person. So I can't imagine how a 5-year-old made sense out of that. And so we were denied our culture, our language. There was a lot of discrediting of our people. You guys are savages. You guys are lazy. You guys, all of these stereotypes that we hear in society today. And it was in order to, make them more vulnerable, make them ashamed of who they were. Thus, they were easier to conform. So that's in a nutshell. That was designed. There was tremendous amounts of abuse, any kind of abuse. There was the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, the emotional, the mental, the spiritual abuse. So that's what the residential school was about. And I can't imagine, like when I do my workshops, I represent a community before contact, and then I represent a community after contact. And when I talk about the community and how we lived with one another before contact, and then I talk about, okay, residential school went on for over 100 years. So the chances of you being over 100 years old is not likely. So a lot of you probably have went to it, or known a child who went to it, or known a cousin who went to it. So how does it feel to know where those children are going to go tonight? How does it feel as a parent to what your child is going to see, feel, experience in the next week? I can't imagine the torture, that mental anguish that must have been existent amongst my people. And remember, like a lot of people say, oh, I would have fought, I would have done this, I would have done that. And it was by law. Anybody who resisted, it was punishable by law. Anybody who tried to stop the RCMP or the Indian agent from taking the children, they would go to jail. So when I think about that learned helplessness, that learned powerlessness, it starts to make sense to me. Like, that's why I saw this and this and this in my community. Okay, I get it. So when we talk about why don't they just get over it, why don't you move on, how do I get over it if I don't know what I'm getting over?
Yeah.
Right? So I don't, and how much of an authentic life am I going to lead? Like when I don't know how to express my emotions, and when I become a parent, how much of an inauthentic relationship I'm going to have with my daughter, which I did personally experience because I had no emotions to give. I didn't know how to, I didn't know how to be happy. I didn't know how to, because anytime something happened, if it was in disagreement with how I was supposed to behave, there was like, smarten up, all of this, I'd be kept to a minimum.
Yeah.
So,
well, it's like, and these children were taken for the school year, right?
Yeah.
And then they were brought back to community. Now these kids have been at war, basically. It's
yeah.
like in a war zone.
Absolutely.
How many of our adult men and women who've been in war zones come back after, a year or two and talk about it? They don't. How many have been damaged? A lot of them. And then you add into that the fact that these children were taken while that brain was being developed.
Yes.
Between birth and about 8 is where you have the neurons connecting it correctly, information going in, how life works. It's all a critical part of wiring the brain itself for the way life is. And when we know that when anyone is either abused or neglected or perceived they're abused or neglected, that brain disconnects just as if it were in a car accident. You get traumatic brain injury, the neurons disconnect, and now, now they're trying to figure out how to function without having built a really strong foundational brain system. And that's a huge part of it also, Brad.
Absolutely. And, and when you mentioned it, like people go off to war and they get traumatized over in war. They remember they're going into that trauma with a higher level of a capacity,
Totally.
They can try to make sense out of it. They can, like Viktor Frankl says, like the meaning of life, right?
Yeah.
You have that ability to tell yourself certain stories in order to survive, right? As a little child, as a little 5-year-old, as a 6-year-old, as a 7-year-old, to witness and to feel all of that trauma taking place. Where do you go with that?
Right.
What do you do with that?
And year after year after year after year.
Absolutely.
I mean, huge trauma.
Absolutely. So when I think about it, and I think about why I got into this, it was like, this could help a lot of people. This could help, this could change a young person's life, because, because of society in Canada, there's a lot of, the stereotypes, like all of the stereotypes about what it means to be Indian in Canada. Oh, Indians get everything for free. Indians are drunk. Indians are lazy. Year after year, generations after generations are getting fed these stereotypes, but they don't know the actual history of why things are the way they are. And if I can just bring that one little bit of hope to that young little Native child, that, you are a part of a long line of generations of warrior blood within you, that we've been fighting for this long. We weren't even supposed to be here. We were supposed to be extinct a long time ago, but yet here we are. When you see, when we think, I like saying this thing about in humanity, like we're conditioned to think only in terms of 20 years in the past and 20 years in the future, right? We've become so consumed with time that we've forgotten about eternity.
That's right.
And then so when I think about it, I'm looking at, if I'm looking at a linear line of all of humanity, and I'm like, okay, there's the Egyptians, there's the Persians, there's the Romans, there's the British, and then, and then it's like, oh, wow, who is that? Oh, those are the Indians. Wow, they sure are taking a beating. I don't know how much longer they can last. And then if I look down further along that linear line of humanity, and I look what's happening to today, humanity is being threatened. The quality of life is being threatened. And if I was allowed to, and I said, whoa, who is that? Oh, those are the Indians. Yeah. They're the ones who are standing rock. They're the ones that fighting the gas lines up in British Columbia. So if I can just tell that history of how far we've been, what we've gone through in the last 500 years to where we are today, and to where people are depending on us to preserve the quality of life as part of humanity. If I can just give that information to the young people, then it'll help combat what they're being exposed to, the negative messages that they're being exposed to, being pummeled by every day, which eventually, if not checked, they're going to internalize it, and eventually they're going to start to behave in that way.
Now tell me, how do your workshops, how have you structured your workshops, and what are you seeing as a result of people going through them?
Well, what I usually do is I introduce myself and I tell my story about how I grew up on the reserve, and what I just explained to you about how I wasn't exposed to any correct information, so to speak, and how that misinformation that I internalized, I just became a part of that ideology, that those stereotypes. Therefore, I started to behave in inferior ways. And what I do is I tell that story, and when I do it, I show a video about Stephen Harper's apology, Canada's apology to the First Nations people. Australia made their apology, New Zealand made their apology. So I show that, I show Stephen Harper making the apology, and he talks about all of the abuses. So now it's not hearsay coming from me, it's actually somebody, credible and, on the world stage, and he's making the apology. So now it becomes a bit more, credible. Let's just go with that. So I show that, and then and then I get into the experiential part, the interactive piece. And what I do is I construct a community, and I put the culture and the tradition right in the middle. I says, what did we hold highest in our communities? It was the traditions, it was the culture, and I named them the reasons why they were so important. And I surrounded by the children, and then I give them reasons why we held them so high. They were our future, right? And then I surrounded by the elders in the circle, and then I tell them why, our wisdom, our gatekeepers of knowledge, they knew our ways, they lived our ways for hundreds of years. And then I get about the real our women, the real power of our communities, and it was always our women who were the leaders, the true backbones of our communities. And then I surrounded by the men, right? And then the warriors, the last line of defense sort of thing. And then I ask everybody to identify, how would it feel to be a part of this community? And I said, I feel safe, I feel protected, I feel loved, I feel like I have a responsibility, I feel valued, I feel, powerful. And how would you expect your future? My future has hope, right? And then, so what I do is I get them to identify with all of these great feelings of being a part of this community, of how we used to live for one another. And then I said, think about your own families. How would it feel if your husband was behind you, supporting you? How would it feel if your children, your grandchildren were in front of you, and everybody was like a fishbowl, looking after the children, guiding the children, protecting the children? And then they start to, you see it in their eyes. They're like, wow, this community is great, And then I start taking that community apart. I talk about what are the historical traumas that started to begin to happen amongst my people all across Canada. And what I do is I start taking it apart. What started to happen as a result of colonization, as a result of contact, and then I take away 90% of the community. Smallpox. So I start taking the community apart, and then how would it feel to be a part of this community? 90% are gone. Long family lineages gone. And then I was like, it would be like kind of in like a shock. You're kind of walking through this world, kind of like numb, in a state of shock. And then all of a sudden the tactics start to come in, the assimilation tactics, the law and policies tactics. And then I start to take the culture away. The one thing that would have helped us get through this, they took away our culture. They banned it in 1885. They said, these ways are the devil's ways. They started to discredit our ways, and they started to make fun of our ways. And then I take that apart. And then I start to say, what else happened? And then I say 1920. And then 1920, they made it mandatory by law. All children have to go to school. So I start taking the children on. And I said, as I mentioned earlier, like, chances are none of us are 100 years old. So chances are we've went to those residential schools, or we know what happens, or know someone who went, So then and all of what used to be a vibrant community, now we can start to feel it. Like the participants can actually feel it. Like it's like the wind gets taken right out of them. And then they're like, oh, wow. And so what I talk about is, again, with law and policy, like in the early 1900s, it was illegal to give our land away. They held it in reserve for us, but then they started to give it away, right, without the consultation of our leaders. And then what they did was, okay, now about 7 years later, they're like, okay, now we got to make another law. Now it's going to be like any Indian who tries to solicit funds to hire a lawyer to battle the government about the giving away the land, punishable by law. So you can see how our hands were literally like this. You can see how the frustration must have been present in our communities. You can see how the powerlessness of not being able to do anything, say anything, or be anything, the helplessness. And you can see all of those, how our communities and what we call social conditions today actually started to present themselves. So in my workshop, it's, once we understand that there's a collective trauma that existed, now we can see the collective feelings that resulted, and it's out of those collective feelings that we start to see those conditions called alcoholism, called, shaming, called bullying, all of the such. So in a nutshell, that is my workshops.
Yeah. Well, and what is it that you're hoping for you know, because you're probably doing a lot and maybe almost to capacity, but how can people support you and encourage this expansion? Because like I say, this is extremely, extremely valuable to build new, because it unlocks it unlocks a perception that your people have dealt with. It certainly has been promoted out in the world.
Yes.
It unlocks the old dinosaur, if you will, and said, we're not even going to deal with that. We're going to take hold, and we are going to take back and build community. You know, so how can people best serve and help you?
Become informed, you know, in whatever ways. Just become informed, you know, like I say with the workshop, it's like once they've been through the process of having to go through and feeling the collective feelings that we just went through in the last hour or 2 hours, they'll, you know, I love that saying, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. So now that you know the real history of what happened to my people in Canada, now it'll change your perception.
Exactly.
Now you can't go back to unknowing it. Now you know it, right? But when you change the way you look at things, the people you look at change. Now you have empathy towards them. And when I do this with the school districts, when I talk to the teachers, you know, I've heard so many stories about, oh, you know, that's just Brad's little brother. He's, you know, he'll never amount to anything. Just keep him in the arts, keep him in physical education, whatever, right?
Yeah.
So now that you know that history of that child, even though that child doesn't know his own history, now you'll be able to, now your energy will change towards that child. And who's going to notice that energy change? The child. And I asked them, how many people have had that one student where the light all of a sudden went off and they started to access potential that you never even thought was possible, and they just blossomed. Almost everybody puts their hand up. And now I asked them what changed. It wasn't that they took a smart pill and just became smart overnight. It's the energy that they felt that you gave them, that you helped them to feel good about themselves. So when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change.
Okay.
So become informed.
So I'm going to be posting your website so people can get a hold of you. They may want to host workshops in other parts of the country or other parts of who knows what, but certainly that might be an option. I know you don't want to be stretched too thin, but workshops, donations, time, money, energy, awareness, always helps. What's new always needs that type of water to kind of help it continue to grow. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Brad.
Thank you, Sharon.
Many blessings on what you're doing. I really love what you're doing, and I'm pleased and proud to have you as one of our gazelles.
Yes. I just wanted to add that, you know, this workshop, even though it comes from the experiences of my people in Canada, it really isn't a workshop about oppression. Because almost everybody who takes this workshop, whatever race they are, they start to make connections. You know, like I had these other different nationalities take part in this, and they started to connect the dots with their own personal experiences. So even though the dates may be different, the details may be different, the methods are different, it's those collective feelings that are the same. And it's those feelings that create those conditions that we see in our communities today. So I just wanted to thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of this. And it's just great work to be a part of. And all we got to do is just keep going.
Keep going, and we'll hold that for you too. So thank you so much, and blessings on your work, Brad.
Yes, thank you so much, Sharon.